In the quiet, tree-lined streets of Midlothian, Illinois, the year 1988 felt like a lingering echo of a simpler era. It was a place where the American dream was not just a concept, but a tangible reality built on the foundations of safety and community. Children rode their bikes until the streetlights hummed to life, and the heavy oak doors of the suburban homes were rarely locked against the night. Midlothian was a sanctuary, or so its residents believed, until the morning of September 10th. 7-year-old Jacqueline Marie Dowlaby was a child of this quietude. With her bright eyes and a gentle disposition, she was the heartbeat of the Dowlaby household. On the evening of September 9th, the world within their home on 147th Street was perfectly ordinary. Jacqueline, dressed in her favorite purple nightgown, had spent her final waking hours immersed in the simple joy of a toy catalog, dreaming of the things a young girl dreams of. Her mother, Cynthia, had checked on her around 11 p.m., finding her daughter surrendered to a peaceful sleep. It was a scene of domestic tranquility that should have remained undisturbed. But as the town of Midlothian fell into a deep, unsuspecting slumber, something shifted in the darkness. The silence of the night was a veil, and behind it, a nightmare was unfolding, one that would not only claim a young life, but would eventually dismantle the very family meant to protect her. When the sun began to rise on Saturday morning, the normalcy of the Dowlaby home evaporated in an instant. David Dowlaby, Jacqueline's adoptive father, awoke to a house that felt unnervingly still. He walked toward Jacqueline's bedroom, perhaps expecting to find her already awake or tangled in her sheets. Instead, he found an empty bed. The purple nightgown was gone. Jacqueline was gone. The initial confusion rapidly spiraled into a cold, paralyzing dread. They searched every corner of the house, calling her name into rooms that offered no answer. It was during this frantic search that David discovered a chilling breach in their sanctuary. A small window in the basement was shattered. Shards of glass littered the floor, and the screen had been forcefully removed. To a father's eyes, it was a clear sign of an intruder, a predator who had slipped through the cracks of their home to steal their child. The police were called, and within hours, the quiet suburb was transformed into a staging ground for a desperate search. Patrol cars lined the streets, and the air was thick with the static of radio chatter. Neighbors gathered on their lawns, their faces etched with a new, sharp kind of fear. The illusion of safety had not just been cracked. It had been pulverized. As the investigation took its first tentative steps, the focus was singular: find Jacqueline. The Midlothian police, joined by the FBI and local volunteers, began a massive sweep of the area. They combed through the nearby woods, peered into the murky depths of local ponds, and organized search parties that moved with a grim, rhythmic determination. Bloodhounds were brought in, their frantic sniffing a haunting soundtrack to the unfolding tragedy. Yet, as the hours turned into days, a heavy realization began to settle over the investigators. There was no ransom note, no mysterious phone calls, no demands for money. This was not a kidnapping for profit. It was something far more dark and inexplicable. The detectives, trained to look for patterns, found themselves staring at a void. The shattered basement window, which David had pointed to as the entry point, began to draw intense scrutiny. Forensic technicians noticed something peculiar, something that didn't quite fit the narrative of a forced entry from the outside. The majority of the glass fragments were not inside the basement, but scattered on the grass outside. It was a small detail, a minor anomaly in the physics of a break-in, but in the eyes of the law, it was the first crack in the family's story. The atmosphere in Midlothian began to sour. The sympathy that had initially flowed toward the Dowlabys started to curdle into suspicion. In the absence of a clear external monster, the human mind instinctively looks closer to home. The media, hungry for a narrative, began to frame the story not just as a disappearance, but as a mystery with a hidden core. Cynthia and David, once the grieving parents at the center of a community's prayers, were now being observed through a different lens. Every televised plea, every tear shed in public, was dissected for authenticity. In the sterile rooms of the police station, the questions began to shift. They were no longer just about where Jacqueline might be, but about what happened inside that house before the sun came up. The detectives were looking for a motive, a flash of anger, or a hidden history of violence, but the Dowlabys remained steadfast in their account. They were a family under siege, mourning a child who was still missing, while simultaneously feeling the weight of an investigation that was slowly turning its gaze upon them. 4 days after Jacqueline vanished, the search reached its grim conclusion. The hope that had sustained the community, however fragile, was extinguished in a desolate corner of Blue Island, about 6 miles from the Dowlaby home. A man named Michael Chapman, walking near a dumpster behind an apartment complex, noticed a pungent, unmistakable scent clinging to the humid September air. Nestled in the tall weeds and discarded debris, he found a bundle. It was a small body, partially obscured by a dark robe and a blanket. The dental records would soon confirm what everyone already feared. It was Jacqueline. She was still wearing the remnants of the clothing she had gone to sleep in, but the innocence of that night had been replaced by a brutal finality. Around her neck was a ligature, a cord that had been used to extinguish her breath. The discovery transformed the missing persons case into a homicide investigation of the highest order. The suburban tragedy had become a cold, hard reality of forensic evidence and autopsy reports. As the news of the discovery broke, a wave of grief washed over Midlothian, but beneath the sorrow, a darker tide was rising. The location of the body, the nature of the crime, and that persistent nagging detail of the broken window were converging into a singular, devastating theory. The authorities were no longer just looking for a killer. They believed they had already found the people responsible. The stage was set for a legal battle that would tear a family apart and leave a community wondering if justice was truly blind or if it was simply looking for the easiest target. The discovery of Jacqueline's body in that desolate, weed-choked lot in Blue Island was the moment the atmosphere in Illinois shifted from frantic hope to a cold, suffocating grief. But for the investigators of the Midlothian Police Department and the Cook County Sheriff's Office, sorrow was a luxury they couldn't afford. The pressure was mounting. A 7-year-old girl had been snatched from her bed in one of the safest reaches of the suburbs, and the public demanded a monster to blame. Yet, as the forensic teams meticulously combed the dump site, the monster they were beginning to envision didn't look like a wandering predator or a career criminal. Instead, the profile was beginning to mirror the very people who had reported her missing. The search for Jacqueline had been a marvel of community mobilization, but the investigation that followed was a masterclass in tunnel vision. From the earliest hours, detectives were troubled by the geography of the crime. The body was found only a few miles from the Dowlaby home, in a location that felt personal, a place someone might choose if they were in a hurry, someone who knew the backroads of the South Side suburbs. When the medical examiner's report arrived, it only deepened the chill. Jacqueline had been strangled with a ligature, a piece of rope. There were no signs of sexual assault, no struggle that suggested a random act of violence. It was a clean, quiet, and efficient killing. To the investigators, this suggested a lack of struggle that usually occurs when a victim knows and trusts their attacker. Back at the Dowlaby residence, the forensic focus intensified on the basement window. It was the smoking gun that didn't smoke. Lead investigators stood in the damp basement, looking at the shattered glass. In a typical break-in, the kinetic energy of a heavy object, a brick or a crowbar, would send a spray of glass shards deep into the room. But here, the basement floor was strangely clean. Outside, however, the grass was littered with fragments. The theory began to solidify like concrete. The window hadn't been broken to get in. It had been broken to get out, or perhaps simply to create the illusion of a forced entry. They believed David or Cynthia had smashed the glass from the inside, pushing the shards outward to frame a phantom intruder. As the search for physical evidence continued, the police began to look for the how. If Jacqueline was strangled with a rope, where did that rope come from? During a search of the Dallaby home, detectives found a length of rope in the garage that David used for household tasks. A forensic analyst claimed the rope matched the characteristics of the ligature found around Jacqueline's neck. In the world of 1980s forensics, matching characteristics was a powerful phrase, often used to bridge the gap between suspicion and certainty, even when the science was more subjective than certain. To the police, the rope was the final piece of a grim puzzle. They didn't have a motive, and they didn't have a confession, but they had a theory that was starting to feel like a fact. The focus then turned to the night of the disappearance. David and Cynthia maintained they had heard nothing. In a small, quiet house, how could an intruder break a window, navigate a dark basement, walk up the stairs, enter a child's room, and carry her out without waking a soul, including the family dog? The silence of the house became, in the eyes of the law, a deafening admission of guilt. They began to scrutinize the Dallabys' behavior. Cynthia was noted for her lack of emotion, a common and dangerous trope used against grieving mothers who don't perform their sorrow in a way the public expects. David was viewed as overly calm, his cooperation seen as a calculated attempt to lead the investigation astray. Then came the eyewitness. A man named Everett Mann claimed that on the night of the disappearance, he had been near the Blue Island apartment complex where Jacqueline's body was eventually found. He told police he saw a car in the parking lot, a car that looked like the Dallabys' Chevy Malibu. However, Mann's testimony was far from ironclad. He was over 100 yards away, in the dark, and by his own admission, had poor eyesight. He couldn't see the driver's face, nor could he confirm the license plate. But in an investigation starving for a breakthrough, Mann's hazy recollection was treated as a definitive sighting. The narrative was now complete. The Dallabys killed their daughter, used their own car to dump the body, and staged a break-in to cover their tracks. By late 1988, the investigation had effectively stopped looking for any other suspects. The leads concerning strange men in the neighborhood or suspicious vehicles were filed away, ignored in favor of the case being built against David and Cynthia. The logic of the investigation had become circular. The parents were the only ones there, so the parents must have done it. Because the parents must have done it, every piece of ambiguous evidence must prove their guilt. This logic ignored the fact that there were no fingerprints, no blood, and no history of abuse in the home. It ignored the reality that David had legally adopted Jacqueline and by all accounts loved her as his own. The pressure reached a boiling point in the local prosecutor's office. Richard Daley, then the state's attorney and a man with significant political ambitions, was overseeing the case. A child murder in the suburbs was a political nightmare that needed a resolution. The Dallabys were not just suspects. They were the solution to a problem. In November 1989, more than a year after Jacqueline was found, the hammer finally fell. David and Cynthia Dallaby were arrested and charged with the murder of their daughter. The community that had once stood in vigil for Jacqueline now watched as her parents were led away in handcuffs. The search for the truth had been replaced by a quest for a conviction, and as the cell doors slammed shut, the Dallabys realized they were no longer fighting to find their daughter's killer, they were fighting for their own lives. The quiet suburb of Midlothian had finally found its monsters, even if they were the ones who had loved the victim most. The arrest of David and Cynthia Dallaby was not just a legal maneuver. It was a public execution of their character. In the eyes of the suburbanites of Midlothian, the mystery had been solved, the monsters were unmasked, and the world was safe again. But for the Dowlabys, the nightmare was only entering its most claustrophobic phase. As they were processed into the Cook County jail system, the weight of the state's narrative began to crush the reality of their grief. They were no longer parents mourning a murdered daughter. They were the Dowlabys, a headline, a cautionary tale of domestic darkness. The prosecution's strategy was built on a foundation of absence. They lacked a smoking gun, a confession, or even a shred of direct physical evidence linking the parents to the act of strangulation. Instead, they relied on the absence of noise, the absence of an external intruder, and the absence of appropriate grief. This was a trial by optics. Lead prosecutor Patrick O'Brien and the ambitious Richard Daley knew that in the court of public opinion, a mother who doesn't scream and a father who remains stoic are often more guilty than a man found with a bloody knife. They painted a picture of a house that was a fortress, an impenetrable space where only the residents could have committed such a crime. The centerpiece of the prosecution's forensic case remained the basement window. To the jury, the physics of the glass shards were presented as an absolute truth. Stage managed, the experts called it. They argued that the Dowlabys, in a moment of cold-blooded calculation, had broken the window from the inside to lead police on a wild goose chase. This theory required the jury to believe that a mother and father, just moments after killing their 7-year-old child, had the presence of mind to carefully curate a crime scene. It ignored the possibility that an intruder, perhaps wearing gloves or using a cloth, could have broken the window in a way that pulled the glass outward, or that the structural integrity of the old frame had caused an unusual shatter pattern. Then there was the rope. The prosecution brought in forensic experts who testified that the ligature found around Jacqueline's neck bore a striking resemblance to a rope found in the Dowlaby garage. In the era before sophisticated DNA profiling was standard in every courtroom, this kind of visual matching carried immense weight. They showed the jury photos of the two ropes side by side, blurring the lines between similar and identical. To a layperson on the jury, it looked like a match. To a scientist, it was merely a common synthetic cord sold in thousands of hardware stores across Illinois. But the prosecution wasn't selling science. They were selling a story. The eyewitness testimony of Everett Mann became the trial's most controversial element. Mann, a man who suffered from significant vision impairment and was standing in a dark parking lot hundreds of feet away, claimed he saw a car like David's Chevy Malibu. The defense hammered at his credibility, pointing out that from his vantage point, he couldn't have seen the color of the car, let alone the driver. Yet, the prosecution framed his testimony as the final link in the chain. They argued that David had driven Jacqueline's body to the Blue Island site while Cynthia stayed home to clean the non-existent crime scene. But the most damaging evidence wasn't physical. It was psychological. The prosecution focused heavily on Cynthia's demeanor. They played clips of her interviews, pointing out her flat affect and her composed voice. They weaponized her strength against her. In the 1980s, the ideal grieving mother was expected to be hysterical, broken, and visible. Cynthia's quiet, private suffering was interpreted by the investigators and subsequently the jury as the coldness of a killer. This motherhood on trial tactic created a bias that no amount of forensic debunking could easily erase. As the trial reached its climax, the defense made a desperate push. They pointed to the lack of any blood, struggle, or forensic trace in the home. They pointed to the fact that no motive had ever been established. Why would these people, who had just legally adopted Jacqueline and were building a life together, suddenly decide to murder her? The prosecution's answer was chilling in its simplicity. We don't need to know why. We only need to know that they were the only ones there. The judge, however, began to see the cracks. In a stunning and rare move before the jury even began deliberations, Judge Richard Neville took a long look at the evidence against Cynthia Dowlaby. He saw the absence for what it was: a total lack of proof. He ruled that the state had failed to provide even a prima facie case against the mother. In a moment of high courtroom drama, the charges against Cynthia were dropped. She was a free woman, acquitted by the court, but the joy was short-lived. The case against David was allowed to proceed. The legal system had effectively split the family in two, declaring the mother innocent while leaving the father to face the fire. The jury was left with a confusing and contradictory set of facts. If Cynthia was innocent, did that mean David acted alone? If there was no evidence of a struggle, how could one person commit this crime without the other knowing? Despite these logical chasms, the momentum of the prosecution was unstoppable. The community wanted a conviction. They wanted the file closed. On a somber afternoon in May 1990, the verdict was read. David Dowlaby was found guilty of the murder of his daughter. He was sentenced to 45 years in prison. As he was led away, Cynthia stood in the gallery, a woman cleared of murder but robbed of her husband and her child. The justice Midlothian had sought was delivered, but to those who looked closely at the evidence, it felt less like a victory and more like a tragic mistake in the making. The conviction of David Dowlaby did not merely close a prison door. It inaugurated a dark chapter in Illinois judicial history. As David began serving his 45-year sentence at the Joliet Correctional Center, a place defined by gray stone walls and ironclad discipline, the world outside remained relentless in its judgment. In Midlothian, the Jacqueline Dowlaby case had become a cautionary tale, a grim reminder that evil was not always a stranger in the bushes, but sometimes the person sitting across the dinner table. But within the sterile silence of his cell, David remained anchored to the only truth he knew. He had not killed his daughter. This post-trial period was a battlefield of opposing realities. On one side stood the state, buoyed by a legal victory led by the ambitious Richard Daley. They had delivered justice for Jacqueline, at least on paper. On the other side was a family dismantled. Cynthia, though acquitted, found herself in a different kind of purgatory. The state's victory against her husband cast a long, dark shadow over her own life. The Department of Children and Family Services, influenced by the trial's outcome, began to question her fitness as a mother. It was a tragedy compounding a tragedy. She had lost her daughter to a killer, her husband to a cell, and now she had to fight the very system that failed her to keep her young son Davy from being snatched away. However, the sheer illogicality of the verdict began to draw the attention of those who sought truth beneath the surface of a conviction. David Protess, a journalism professor at Northwestern University, and Rob Warden, a veteran investigative reporter, began to peel back the layers of the case. They didn't view the trial through the lens of suburban fear or political pressure. They looked at it through the cold mechanics of physical logic. They started asking the questions the police had conveniently ignored. How could a man commit a perfect murder, leaving no blood, no struggle marks, and no forensic trace in a small house, all while his wife and son slept meters away? Protess and Warden focused their investigation on the anchor of the prosecution's case, the basement window. They consulted with independent forensic experts who pointed out a glaring flaw in the state's staged entry theory. If the window had been broken from the inside to push glass outward, the force required would have left distinct marks on the inner frame marks that were notably absent. Furthermore, they discovered that the police had minimized reports of a suspicious man seen in the neighborhood on the night of the disappearance, a man who bore a striking resemblance to a relative of Jacqueline's biological father with a history of mental instability. While David sat in prison, the media narrative began to shift. The unfeeling mother and the stoic killer archetypes were replaced by the image of a family caught in a bureaucratic vice. The investigative team worked tirelessly with Cynthia and David's defense attorneys to prepare an appeal that would challenge the very foundations of the Cook County State's Attorney's Office. They weren't just fighting for one man's freedom. They were exposing a system that had prioritized a win over the truth. The emotional rhythm of this period was one of agonizing slowness punctuated by flashes of hope. Every letter David wrote from Joliet was a testament to his endurance, while every legal brief filed by his team was a strike against the state's narrative. The tension was no longer about who did it, but about whether the law was brave enough to admit a mistake. As the appeal moved toward the Illinois Appellate Court in 1991, the community of Midlothian remained divided. Some clung to the jury's verdict as a shield against the unknown, while others began to realize that if the Dowlabys were innocent, then a killer was still walking their streets, perhaps watching the very same streetlights hum to life as they did on that fateful night in September. The logic of the investigation was finally being subjected to the scrutiny it should have received from the start. The eyewitness, Everett Mann's testimony, was dismantled by optics experts who proved it was physically impossible for him to identify a specific car make and model from his distance in the dark. The matching rope was revealed to be a common variety found in millions of homes. The case against David Dallaby wasn't a chain of evidence. It was a series of coincidences forged into a collar by a desperate prosecution. The stage was now set for a judicial reversal that would shock the state, but for the Dallabys, the damage was already indelible. The legal system is often described as a wheel, slow and grinding, but for David Dallaby, that wheel had spent 2 years spinning in a direction that defied gravity and logic. By 1991, the momentum of the prosecution's staged crime scene theory had begun to stall against the hard reality of judicial review. The Illinois Appellate Court took up the case with the skepticism that had been missing in the original trial. They weren't looking at the Dowlabys as characters in a suburban tragedy. They were looking at the trial record as a series of legal failures. The three-judge panel focused intensely on the evidence that had supposedly proven David's guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. They revisited the basement window, the cornerstone of the state's narrative. They noted that the prosecution's experts had never actually proven the window couldn't have been broken from the outside. More importantly, they looked at the eyewitness, Everett Mann. The court recognized what the jury had ignored, that a man with poor vision, standing in a dark parking lot 100 yards away, seeing a car similar to a common Chevy Malibu, did not constitute proof of murder. It was at best a whisper of a hunch. In a landmark decision in October 1991, the appellate court did something rare. They didn't just order a new trial. They vacated David Dallaby's conviction entirely. The judges ruled that the evidence presented by the state was so legally insufficient that no rational trier of fact could have found him guilty. It was a stinging rebuke of the Midlothian police and the state's attorney's office. The court essentially stated that the state had built a house of cards on a foundation of sand. On a crisp autumn afternoon, David Dallaby walked out of the prison gates and back into the arms of Cynthia. The images of their reunion, tearful, exhausted, and shell-shocked, were broadcast across the nation. For a moment, it felt like the nightmare was over. But for the Dallabys, freedom was not the same as peace. They were innocent in the eyes of the law, but in the eyes of many in Midlothian, they were simply the ones who got away with it. The stigma of being accused of your own daughter's murder does not wash off with a court ruling. They had lost years of their lives, their reputation was in tatters, and their daughter was still dead. The question that had been buried under the weight of their prosecution now rose to the surface with a terrifying urgency. If David and Cynthia didn't do it, then who did? With the parents cleared, The investigation into Jacqueline's death officially became a cold case, but for investigative journalists David Protess and Rob Warden, the trail had never gone cold. It had just been ignored. They turned their attention back to a name that had appeared in the early files, Timothy Guess. Timothy was the brother of Jacqueline's biological father, and his history was a tapestry of psychiatric struggles and erratic behavior. Unlike the Dowlabys, Timothy had no alibi for the night of the disappearance. More disturbingly, in interviews with investigators, Timothy had demonstrated an uncanny, detailed knowledge of the interior of the Dowlaby home, details he shouldn't have known, including the specific layout of the rooms and the placement of Jacqueline's bed. Timothy Guess had even claimed to have visions of the crime. In these visions, he described the intruder entering through the very basement window that the police claimed was staged. He spoke of the child being carried out in a way that mirrored the forensic findings. To a seasoned investigator, these weren't visions. They were the slips of someone who had been there. Yet, in 1988, the police had dismissed Timothy because he had a mental condition and because they were already convinced the parents were the culprits. They had traded a viable lead for a convenient target. The logic of the original investigation had been so centered on the family that it created a vacuum where a predator could hide. Protess and Warden's work exposed that while the police were busy analyzing glass shards to frame David, they were ignoring a man with a documented history of instability who was intimately connected to the family's past. Timothy Guess was never charged. He remained a shadow in the periphery of the case until his death in 2002. With his passing, a potential key to the truth was buried forever. The impact of the Dowlaby case on the Illinois legal system was profound. It became a textbook example of tunnel vision, a psychological phenomenon where investigators become so convinced of a suspect's guilt that they subconsciously filter out any evidence to the contrary. It forced a conversation about the dangers of using demeanor evidence against grieving parents. The case also highlighted the terrifying power of a high-profile prosecutor like Richard Daley to influence the speed of a conviction at the expense of its accuracy. As the mid-90s arrived, the Dowlabys attempted to rebuild. They moved away from Midlothian, trying to find a corner of the world where their names didn't trigger a whisper. They had their son, Davy, but the ghost of Jacqueline followed them. Every September 10th was a milestone of what was lost. The Gone in the Night television movie brought their story to millions, further cementing the case as a symbol of injustice, but no movie could bring back the 7-year-old girl in the purple nightgown. The case remained open on the books of the Cook County Sheriff's Office, a silent testament to a failure that could never be fully repaired. The justice that had been reversed for David was a hollow victory because the ultimate justice identifying and convicting the person who took Jacqueline's breath remained a vanishing point on the horizon. In the decades that followed the release of David Dowlaby, the streets of Midlothian reclaimed their suburban quiet, but the silence was of a different quality. It was no longer the silence of safety. It was the silence of a secret that had refused to be told. The case of Jacqueline Marie Dowlaby transitioned from a breaking news headline into a spectral presence in the archives of American jurisprudence. It became a permanent fixture in the cold case files of the Cook County Sheriff's Office, a ledger of a failure that spanned generations. For the Dowlaby family, the reversal of the conviction was a legal victory, but it was not a restoration. You cannot restore a life that has been dismantled by the dual engines of a child's murder and a state's wrongful prosecution. David and Cynthia moved away, seeking the anonymity that the South Side of Chicago could no longer provide. They attempted to build a fortress of normalcy for their son Davy, but the perimeter of that fortress was always patrolled by the memory of what happened in September 1988. The legacy of the Dowlaby case is one of profound systemic caution. It remains a primary case study in the dangers of tunnel vision in criminal investigations. Law enforcement agencies now use the case to train detectives on the necessity of exhausting every external lead before narrowing the focus to the family unit. The staged basement window, once the pride of the prosecution's forensic theory, is now cited as a warning about the subjectivity of physical evidence. It reminds us that when investigators start with a conclusion, they will inevitably find the evidence to support it, even if they have to bend the laws of physics or ignore the presence of a predator in the periphery. The case also catalyzed a change in how the media and the public perceive grieving parents. The Cynthia Dowlaby effect, the unfair vilification of a mother for her perceived lack of public emotion, is now a recognized bias that defense attorneys work tirelessly to counteract in modern trials. The human cost of the investigation's failure extends beyond the Dowlaby family to the community itself. For a time, Midlothian was a town that believed it had looked into the face of evil and found it residing in a local living room. When that narrative collapsed, it left a vacuum of fear. If the parents didn't do it, then a killer had been amongst them, watching the police tape go up, perhaps even standing in the crowds during the search parties. That killer had successfully navigated the legal system by allowing the authorities to focus on the wrong targets. The proximity of the real suspect, Timothy Guess, and the failure to pursue him with the same vigor used against David and Cynthia, remains the most haunting what-if of the entire saga. Timothy's death in 2002 essentially sealed the mystery. He carried whatever secrets he had to the grave, leaving behind only the visions he had shared with investigators, visions that were never tested in a court of law. Today, the story of Jacqueline Dowlaby is often told through the lens of the television movie Gone in the Night or in true crime podcasts that dissect the forensic errors of the 1980s. But beneath the layers of media analysis and legal theory lies the reality of a 7-year-old girl who loved books and wore a purple nightgown. Jacqueline is not a case file or a legal precedent. She was a child whose future was extinguished. Her grave in a quiet cemetery serves as a somber landmark of a quest for justice that went tragically off course. The failure of the state to find her actual killer is a secondary tragedy that compounds the first. It is a reminder that in the pursuit of a conviction, the truth can sometimes become a casualty of the process. The legal machinery may have finished its work, but the moral machinery of the case remains in motion, forever questioning how a system designed to protect the innocent could fail a child so completely, twice. The Dowlaby's journey through the American legal system underscores a terrifying truth, that innocence is not always a shield. It is a fragile state that can be shattered by a broken window and a prosecutor's ambition. David and Cynthia lived through the ultimate nightmare, the loss of a child followed by the loss of their freedom and reputation. While they eventually found a measure of peace in their private lives, the public record of their struggle serves as a permanent testament to the fallibility of human judgment. The Gone in the Night moniker is fitting not just for Jacqueline's disappearance, but for the way the truth itself vanished into the shadows of a flawed investigation. As long as the case remains unsolved, the ghost of Midlothian continues to whisper a warning to every investigator who enters a crime scene. Do not let the desire for an answer outweigh the commitment to the truth. As we look back on the case from the perspective of the 21st century, with all our advancements in DNA and digital surveillance, the Dowlaby investigation feels like a relic from a different world. Yet the human elements, the fear, the bias, the rush to judgment remain constant. The case of Jacqueline Dowlaby is a mirror held up to society, reflecting our desperate need to find a culprit even when the evidence is a ghost. It reminds us that justice is not just about a verdict. It is about the integrity of the path taken to reach it. In the end, the story of the Dowlabys is a tragedy in 3 acts. A murder, an injustice, and a lingering silence. It is a story that ends not with a gavel strike, but with a question that still hangs in the humid air of an Illinois night, unanswered and perhaps unanswerable. Jacqueline Marie Dowlaby remains gone in the night, her memory a flickering candle in the vast, dark expanse of America's unsolved mysteries. The case of Jacqueline Dowlaby remains more than just a dusty file in the Cook County archives. It is a haunting reminder of the fragility of justice and the enduring ache of a family left without answers. 36 years have passed, and the true shadow behind that September night may have already vanished, carrying the truth to a silent grave. If you believe in the pursuit of truth behind the darkest chapters of criminal history, please subscribe and turn on notifications to join us as we continue to unearth these forgotten stories. Your support ensures that the voices of the innocent are never silenced and that the search for accountability, however delayed, never reaches an end. Stay safe, stay vigilant, and we will see you in the next investigation.